This video made possible by the Global Innovation Exchange. Visit gixnetwork.org to learn more.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very interesting and hopefully very exciting panel this morning. We're going to talk about the future of offices and the future of factories. My name is Maria Karaivanova. I'm an investor with Madrona Venture Group. I focus primarily on enterprise investing. We are a Pacific Northwest focused fund based here in Seattle. And we also do spend a lot of time in the IoT space. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists today. We have Dr. Sarah Cooper, who is the GM of IoT and Analytics and Applications at AWS. Sala Palos, who is the Director of Emerging Technology and Innovation at Cellen. And last but not least, Ryan Mullenix, who is a partner at NBBJ. And what I'd like to do is, first of all, to ask you to introduce yourselves a little bit further and talk about your roles, specifically as they relate to our topic today. So I'm going to start with Sarah, please.
Hello, everybody. You're guaranteed excitement because this is at 6 shots of espresso so far this morning. So my teams at AWS are focused on kind of the value side of IoT. There's a lot that goes into the infrastructure of connecting devices, dealing with transport protocols, and I'm sure we'll get into all of this. What do you put on embedded devices? What do you do with that data once it gets into the cloud is kind of where my team works, and as well as kind of moving that back down to the edge. I've been in the IoT space for a very long time. It used to be called machine-to-machine. There's some reasons why it has a new name. Hopefully we don't get into those. I've also been a consumer of machine-to-machine technologies. I had a chemical additives business years ago where we had mining operations on 3 continents. So in order to understand how aluminosilicate nanotubes get extracted from clay and beds, you really have to understand kind of what the quality and the extraction looks like. So we had lots of technologies to do that remotely. Next.
You're scary. So I'm from Cellen Construction. My name is Salla Palos, and I'm the Emerging Technology and Innovation Director. And what we are doing at Cellen is we are trying to push the industry and our own business towards the Industry 4.0 and adapt to the emerging technologies like IoT and make the reality of the dreams that the architects design for the end users, and also at the same time create smart job sites so we can leverage the technologies that are now available for the end users, also for our own teams, and hopefully in the future increase the productivity and profitability of the projects. So I'm in the fund space of construction industry, and I have my background as a Master of Science in Architecture, so I'm an architect like Ryan. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ryan Mullenix. I'm a design partner and architect at NBBJ. I wear a lot of hats, but 3 things I think that are important for today. One is I help lead design of workplaces around the world, and so we're constantly working with organizations to figure out where they need to be and then how design can support that. I'm also a leader of our fellowship program, which is internal to NBBJ, but for the past 4 years, we've been working with Dr. John Medina, who's a neuroscientist at the University of Washington, looking at how our brains respond and react to physical space and how we can improve the places that people are. And then the last thing I get to do is hang out with our digital team where we write custom algorithms that look at how we solve problems, but we're starting to get into the world of virtual reality as a decision-making tool as well. So how you begin to bridge the gaps around information that comes through those algorithms, but also how you see that in a more active way.
Well, thanks for these introductions. You know, I'd like to start with the basics. Smart anything is such a buzzword these days. So, would really like to get your take on what makes an office building and a factory smart. Kind of what does it take for us to call one of those buildings smart?
Okay, you may have to start pointing to us. This is more of a personal definition because I'm asked this a lot by customers. I've put in XYZ sensors. Do I have a smart building? And typically, if you have to ask AWS, you probably aren't using the data, so that would say, no, it's not a smart building. For us, and there's a difference between kind of commercial space like the one that we're in, where we often see environmental sensors, things focused on energy. If you are responding automatically to those in order to make a more pleasant environment for your workers, should be number one, usually somewhere in the bottom of the list. Or if you are, changing the temperature in response to energy demands, that is something that we would consider a smart building. In the factory space, you typically have that, but you also have things like humidity sensors. Humidity is critically important to curing of adhesives, for example. Where that you're taking what is often what we call an overlay network, so you got sensors that are not directly connected into the process automation systems. That is an added complexity for factories to be smart, because you've got to be able to react to a way that is business impactful with those sensors. So if your factory building is smart, but it's only doing energy management, that's great. There's good corporate benefits. But if you're tying that factory building infrastructure into the main purpose of that building, like production, that's where we would consider that a smart factory. Do you guys have other definitions, please?
Yeah, no, I think that was great. I would add, I think smart buildings are responsive buildings, as you described. I think that's perfectly true. I'm interested in the personalization of that, though. One of the things we've learned from neuroscience is that stress is a loss of control. So you build these smart buildings that are responsive, but what are they responsive to? Are they responsive just to the environment? So I work in a building where we have automated shading systems that come down. They're not dependent on weather, they're dependent on time. So when you live and work in Seattle and it's a glorious day that's not too sunny but not too cloudy, and the shades come down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and they don't need to.
That one day?
There's a stress level that begins to increase there that is unfortunate. So as I look at the building side, I also think it's important to think about the personalization, the customization of the space as well. I think we can use sensors to do the same thing, and I think that there's a big future in that also.
Well, Ryan, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to define my smart building, and I define it as a physical, social, and virtual space. And as we are building these strategic workplaces and amazing buildings that are smart buildings, we're also building a city that overall becomes a smart city from smart neighborhoods and smart districts. And as we are gathering and producing the data, we are exchanging data between the buildings and the machines and the people using them. So it's a matter of how we exchange the data and how we consume it, and that creates the smart environment for us.
This is all great definitions, but one thing that will be really helpful to me and hopefully to the audience is to kind of take you back in time. You have long experience in this space, and let's think about state of art in that space. So what was considered state of art 10 years ago, you described what is kind of state of art today, and where are things headed? Like, what is the future 5 to 10 years from now? Are we going from dumb buildings to sustainable buildings to smart buildings? Is there something else after? Would love your thoughts on how the industry and the space has evolved in your careers.
From a contractor point of view, smart buildings and IoT was not really synonyms 10 years ago. They were completely different topics of research, and funny enough, I was doing research on both, but we were more focused on building information models, and that was the hot topic 10 years ago. Now that is an old technology, but it is now the foundation for Internet of Things in the built environment. I'd say that the state of the art now is more of retrofit solutions in existing built environment. You can plug and play basically your Internet of Things devices and create the mesh, the network. But 10 years from now, the systems are going to be more integrated into the holistic built environment, into the buildings and into the traffic networks and into the overall built environment. So everything will be connected, and it's going to be a connection between machine to machine and machine to human. So it's fairly interesting to see where things go.
I would just say state of the art, I feel like 10 years ago was any sort of network that worked was state of the art. I look now and I see a near future where, like the autonomous vehicle, we look at reconfigurable workspaces that actually move according to what kind of work mode is going to happen in those spaces. I don't think that's that far off. We have the technology. It's actually a lot easier to achieve inside of a space. I think that we'll have vertical conference rooms because we're thinking about how infrequent conference room use or shape is the right size for what you might need. And so to kind of tuck those away or slide those out of a space will be important. In the future, down the road, I hope that we find a way that we make our building envelopes malleable. Right now, it's a fixed structure and a fixed glass or concrete wall. And what that means is that your space inside of that is confined to that footprint. So as I was talking about configurable spaces, I do see configurable buildings coming. So imagine having a membrane that can begin to stretch. And as we talk about density, we talk about use, we talk about mixing the office environment with the living environment. And we think about how we can house people overnight and have them work during the day. To have a building that can reconfigure itself through data and information on the human side, I think is really important. The last thing I would add is I hope that in all of this, we don't just rely on technology. I know one of the things we've been talking about is biophilia and sort of what that means to us as humans. We have spent 99.987% of our lives outside as humans over 2 million years. We wonder why people are unhappy when we shove them into buildings now. I think the future state of the art in the future has to tap into the natural environment as well.
So and before we go to Sarah, who can tell us how it all comes together with technology, but how do you guys think, what is the design process to set the stage for coming to this state? Because 5 to 10 years from now is not a long time, especially when it comes to the real estate industry. So what are the considerations that go into your design thinking? How are things different today than they were 10 years before, especially when you're doing greenfield projects? Can you talk about that? And either Sal or Ryan.
So today, the design process has changed quite a bit. Traditionally, the designers were siloed before the contractor was even chosen for a project. And nowadays, we have different delivery methods, and we talk about integrated project delivery, which brings the contractor into the same team, basically, as the design and engineering team is. And that way, we can start configuring the constructability of the building at the early on stages of the building life cycle and start configuring, do we build on site or do we build off site? And that's going to be something that the industry is looking into in the near future. And maybe you can talk more about from the design point of view. Yeah,
I think we've become, as an industry, much more integrated in what we're doing, and yet at the same time, I'd say our industries are pretty far behind in terms of innovation. I'm really encouraged by the thought of open source versus IP from a design standpoint. It's really hard as a creative because you have these ideas and you want to hold on to them and make sure that you get the credit or you get paid for it. It actually holds us back in certain regards. I think about some of the way we can use technology as more of an open platform in what we call a charrette mode, which is where everybody kind of pulls together in one big room and starts to solve problems. I see that as the way to do it versus one-offs that are these experiments, but rather still allow those experiments to happen, but then pull a larger brain trust together to figure out how to implement it faster.
And so at what point do you engage with the technologists to actually think about, okay, have we created the right space and the right designs to enable this connectivity and everything talking to each other and being interoperable? At what point do you call Sarah and her team?
Hopefully at the start.
Yeah, it's really really important to have the end users and the owners and the future tenants part of the design and the pre-construction process, so we don't end up building something and then changing it because it's not meeting the requirements or the needs of the end users. So I support the idea that as early on as possible.
From our perspective, it still today, it was true 10 years ago as well, we typically get pulled in after the fact. And that's actually true even within our own buildings, where, everything is under such tight budget, time constraints, you got to get the building in, and then somebody goes, oh, shoot, wouldn't it be awesome if we could do X? And then, I think this is an IoT problem, solution paper someplace. Somebody from my team shows up on site going, well, do you have connectivity? Okay, good. That's starting with number one. I think we're actually seeing an earlier cycle now with some of the smart factories than we are with the smart buildings. And that's in part because there are some really good technologies from folks like Honeywell. There's a product called Niagara that does protocol translation. So there's some interoperability solutions today in the smart building space that don't exist in the smart factory space, where SCADA networks, these are the networks that pass data around from each individual piece of equipment, are still fairly proprietary. And there are protocols like OPC-UA, which is a standard that is a translation protocol that is getting some good adoption. But all that does is still lay the foundation within factory environments to be able to hang things off of it. And 10 years ago, these were very closed systems. They are just now starting to open up and become IP-based. So
Sarah, you talk in some of your presentations about this movement from many to one, because you have thousands of sensors and cameras and all these devices that work together, and hopefully Alexa or Alexa's cousins empowering
hopefully.
it all as you walk into those spaces. But what makes it all happen? What is the fabric, and what needs to happen for us to get to this state of everything working together without glitches from day one?
Well, first of all, it's not a technology problem. So I should just drop the mic and walk away. It's a business problem. And the business problem is it's very easy for a manufacturer of a single device to figure out what the value is to the end customer of that device and to charge them appropriately. I'm delivering a humidity sensor. Great. My job is done. I'm even going to give you some analytics to tell you how, predicting changes in the humidity, giving you an alert when the humidity is beyond a threshold that you're interested in. The problem is humidity is one factor in potentially thousands or hundreds of thousands of factors when you're talking about a factory manufacturing, tape. And the additive value of data from not just the humidity sensor, but also the MES system. That's a manufacturing execution system. It tells PLCs how to move, basically. The additive value is very hard for any one organization to capture and then redistribute, right? If you think of an airport, one of my favorite smart environments, you've got maybe 5 or 6 different operators on the tarmac. Those LD3 carts, the baggage carts, are all leased from another company that doesn't even have a presence on the tarmac. Turns out airlines get the majority of their benefit when they can turn planes around fast. You'd never guess it based on how long those things are delayed. But fast turnaround means money. And yet, to get all of those operators sharing data so that the baggage scan devices, plus the RFID tags on the conveyor belts, plus the LD3 carts, which are rented from one operated by another company, to get all of that data together so that the bag makes sure it's on the plane, means that that value of getting that bag quickly on the plane has to then be redistributed, because otherwise I'm only going to do it if my customer tells me I have to. So really it's about how do you redistribute the additive value of bringing all that data together. Once you give people financial incentive, oh look, I'll move over to that protocol, no problem. it's a fairly quick transition.
I was just going to add, so one of the ways that we found that effective, and this is a 15-year-old project, but it was linking the tangible to that data. So Boeing Future Factory, actually Move to the Lake, was that project is in Renton. And if you've been there before, it's right on the water. And Boeing asked us to come in and understand how their work mode was effective and where it was lagging. And what we did was we ended up putting, as simple as it sounds, the engineers and the fabricators together in one space. We put the plane, which comes off, the fuselage comes off of a cargo line, train line. We put it on a moving conveyor belt. And you saw the thing moving, knowing that by the time it got to the other end of the factory, it needed to be done. And so you have all the information, all the data right in front of you, but you also see live what that information is telling you. And we were able, with Boeing, to reduce their time to create a 737 from 22 days to 11 days. So the sense of urgency was tied to that data, and the money being spent was direct and apparent.
And how does it feel inside of the factory? Because, I'll read you guys some stats that I've been researching. And so, smart factories are revolutionizing manufacturing by enabling 7x increase to productivity in like the next 4 years. So that's a mind-boggling. If I'm Boeing and if you can make my workforce and able to turn on 7 times more airplanes, that's phenomenal because I'm constantly behind schedule probably. So like, how does it actually feel, and why, and who is doing interesting stuff in this space and how are you guys enabling it? I know it's lots of questions, but what would it mean for a worker to walk into one of those factories of the future versus what they do today?
I think it's an interesting question, and I get asked it all the time about whether there will be workers in the factory of tomorrow. And the answer is there will be. We deal a lot with machine learning and AI and understanding where it plays and where it doesn't play. And I was just at a large oil and gas customer who was talking about they've got kind of a workforce challenge. They've got folks who've been in the role for 30 to 40 years. And then because of business economics and outsourcing, they've got a gap in kind of mid-career workforce, and they've got a bunch of late 20, early 30-year-olds. And the difference in digital comfort level is massive. But the guys have been doing it for 30 years. They walk up to a pipe and they take out a coin, and they tap the coin against the pipe, and based on what it sounds like, they can figure out what the corrosion level is on that pipe. Now, somebody in like 20s comes up, they pick out their tablet with VR and AR capabilities if it's a tablet, and they look at it, and they see the sensor data, and they kind of run it along, and they see the heat map of, corrosion predictive, and they both feel like they've got the right answer. How do you merge those two worlds? Because you need both. The domain expertise of folks who have been working these plants for the last 30 years is the only way machine learning actually gets to the point where it can help in those kinds of use cases. But the trick to making that happen and to making it a work environment where you're not taking somebody who's been working with steel for 30 to 40 years and stick them behind a desk with a laptop, because that's my job, and let me tell you, I'd rather be out tapping a pipe these days. Sitting at a desk, especially as my Apple Watch tells me to get up every hour, is not, why people got into aerospace or oil and gas. And so figuring out how do you meld those worlds and the psychology of how do you help somebody trust a result that's coming from machine learning, and where do you start with that to give them reinforcements, because we all like systems that tell us we're right.
And to that, my hope is that as we advance in the future, that those factories become smaller. So our machinery becomes smaller, the space needed becomes smaller. When they become smaller, I think those buildings become more human. There was a term back in the Industrial Revolutions called euthenics, and it was, believe it or not, just human-centered design, which has been thrown around as this recent novel idea. Nope, it's been around for a long time. And the challenge that they had in factories back then, of course, was that the conditions were deplorable. And so there were mandates around natural light and natural ventilation and work hours, all the things that came out of that, which we try to base things on now. My hope is that as factories become smaller, not these big giant steel behemoths, that's then a chance to create the environment like you're describing as well, along with technology, to make it kind of a win-win for both sides.
Not to take credit for that, but e-commerce and the delivery of products within 2 hours is making that happen. There are lots of consumer goods who are looking at putting factories next to the 20 largest North American cities and doing a lot of additive manufacturing so that you can order something, hopefully through Amazon, and not only is it delivered within 2 hours, but it's actually manufactured and then delivered within 2 hours to your specification, which would be awesome.
To put a spin on construction on this topic, I see the same issues in construction as there is in factory work. We are really labor-intensive industry, and there's a lot of talk about robotics and automation and how that is going to change the way that we work. We have the same problem that our workforce is retiring more than we are attracting new workforce, and that's why we are now looking into virtual learning and extended reality to ensure that the knowledge transfer between those who've been in the industry for 30 years are capable of training those who are now entering the workforce, and those who don't have the 30 years of experience can actually perform at a higher skill level than they would normally do. And overall, the data that we have available, the Internet of Things, can then trigger the Internet of Actions and have people be more predictive and proactive in what they start working on, so that we are not hurrying to wait and there is less idle time.
Well, this was really interesting. One thing that I was thinking about as I was listening is, okay, we have all of the sensors and all of this data collected and coming in and out of my office or factory, and my lights are adjusted and my blinds and my humidity and everything else. But what about hackers and security? That's kind of one thing. And then the second thing is privacy. How do employees in those environments feel about being constantly monitored and followed and tracked? So those are two separate topics. One is around cybersecurity and or physical security, but the second one is around privacy. Would love your thoughts on it.
From construction point of view, it's in the state of Washington that we cannot track people, but we can track items, and we have a lot of machinery that is super expensive and tools that are really expensive, and they get lost or misplaced from time to time. So it is a technology that has a lot of solutions for the needs that we have, but there is that question of how can we use those technologies without interfering with people's privacy, and at the same time make sure that we are building client confidential projects that we can really discuss outside of the project teams. So it's an everyday discussion and issue that our Director of Technology is looking into. So it's an interesting topic.
On the cybersecurity side, Amazon and AWS, security is the #1 priority. And because of that, AWS IoT decided to bake security in. You can't bring devices that don't meet our security requirements into the AWS IoT environment. What that means for our customers is that they have strong best practices and standards that they need to be able to meet encrypted data, certificates on devices, which means they can be uniquely identified when bringing devices into our environment. And I think we have lots of conversations about what are the other best practices, making sure you don't have a password that is admin or password with money signals. I get onto Wi-Fi all the time with these kinds of things. There is still a lot to be done, because I think one of the big challenges is there are ground-up security. How do I secure that specific device and its communication channels? And then there's top-down behavioral security techniques. How do I understand whether my device is behaving in a way that I expect it to or that I want it to? We have some products around that, but even defining what your policy is requires truly understanding your environment, which surprisingly, that's not all that common. Privacy is another one that it's really, there's some good tooling out there, but it's how it's applied. And certainly we've seen lots of government regulation, GDPR for anyone in the IT world. You have re-architected your product probably. But understanding not just what happens to my first level data, the things I generated directly, but then when it goes into an application, how does that application share it and where does that end up going? And that provenance of my data following through the systems is something that I don't think we do very well today, and we need to in order to truly protect individuals.
I think the privacy conversation is the one that's most intriguing to me. So I always think about personal privacy versus professional privacy, and the people who are willing on the personal side to share all their data so they can watch a cat video versus what they're willing to share in the work environment. And you think about the repercussions of that. You always think that someone's watching over me in the work environment. If you know it's called the Edge Building in Amsterdam. It's Deloitte's headquarters. I think it's their headquarters there. It's a pretty fascinating, smart building. It does everything. It's predictive. It gets your cup of coffee started when you badge in the morning. And they've actually had to shut down a number of those sensors because it creeped everybody out. Everybody felt like they were being monitored, watched. And it's trying to be smart, right? It's trying to take the hassles, trying to reduce that stress I was talking before out of the way. We actually hacked some Arduino boards internally at MBBJ and put sensors in our New York office every 10 feet. And the key there was we didn't tie it to any one person. We tied it to, I think we didn't tie it even to badges. I think it was just sensors that came to your phone, which, yes, can be linked if you want it to be. But people then had the chance to look and say, this is the type of work environment I'm looking for. I need it to be quiet. I need it to be loud. I need it to be light. I need it to be dark. And instead of then wandering around a floor, they actually could find it. It's really, really basic. I have a feeling if we had gone in and said, we're going to install these sensors by an outside company, it wouldn't have happened. Mm-hmm. So there was something about making it sort of roll up your sleeves and internal that enabled us to do that.
To your point about privacy tolerance or share tolerance, maybe, it dramatically differs around the world, too. There's been some wonderful studies about what it means in North America, the U.S. versus Canada even, and then what are people willing to share for what kind of group benefit, particularly in China and Japan and Korea. And we have, to your point, when asked about sharing information and given the benefits, we typically will do it in North America if the benefit is personal. In many Asian countries, if the benefit is even to the larger group but not directly to me, then I will opt in to share data. And there's an expectation, I think, of personal privacy that is different between the regions, and there's all sorts of psychology that behind that as well. But if you ever see those, it's super fascinating to kind of understand how people see their data.
One of the things I think will be interesting, it's already happening, is the democratization of choice in our environments. And so you might be aware of this, but right, it's color, light, whatever it might be, a temperature. So it's basically a poll that comes out, could be in the morning, could be every moment of the day, and your team is voting on the right condition. And so hopefully you're not the loser in that voting. But I think that's going to put some stress on the system as well, because it's not about the ideal setting, it's about a consensus-driven setting, which is not necessarily ideal.
Survivor. Who are we going to vote off the temperature sensor?
And the temperature sensors, they tie us into the digital twin of buildings and how we can leverage the building information models for the maintenance and operations of buildings. So data security and data transfer are different things that people tend to mix up. And that's kind of holding back how we can leverage BIM usage into the entire building life cycle. We need to exchange data during the operations, and we need to know how the building is operating and how the end users are using the building. So if we are holding back that data, then we're going to end up with, I don't know what type of environment I would describe it to be, but not smart.
Well, this is a good segue to, from, and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions, but from the individual standpoint, moving from, what I like and how I want my environment into what are the standards, what are the new standards that you guys see that govern kind of your industries and make it possible for you to do your job effectively around the globe? One that I find fascinating came about in 2014. It's called the WELL Building Standard, which is just guidelines for how you design the building so that people are happier and more productive. Curious, what do you see on the standard side and how enforceable they are, and how much do you have to work to get your colleagues in your ecosystem to kind of come together behind those new standards?
They always look at me.
It's how my chair is.
Yeah. So, full disclosure, I was on what's called MQTT, which is the transport protocol. I was on the technical committee for years. I think from a technology standpoint, so there are standards about how to apply these technologies and best practices, which I think I'll let you guys talk about. From the individual standards standpoint, there was a trend that started maybe about 5 to 7 years ago. Standards became the new vendor lock-in. How's that for, controversial statement? But every company had a standard that if they could just get everybody else to use, they'd either be stepping on their IP, or at least they'd be ahead of the market because they'd already instrumented it locally. And there was a big kind of push one way or the other, and some of them became very large and were able to sort of generalize the benefit. MQTT was started by IBM as an offshoot from something they have called MQ, which is a messaging transport. But now it's broadly adopted across many different industry segments, and it provides kind of a basic transport protocol. I think the thing that needs to happen is we need to kind of let go of that particular business strategy, or at least hand maybe standards over to industry consortiums. OPC-UA is a good example of that. Microsoft has a fairly heavy hand in that particular standard, but it's been largely it's the users of that standard, the industrial companies who have been able to push back and say, here is what makes difference, and I'm not going to adopt it if it doesn't. So I'm hoping we're seeing the pendulum swing the other direction where we can have fewer standards, because there are tons of them. The number of low-power network standards is just mind-boggling. But I think it really does take a business will and an understanding to kind of hand back the standard to the end customer and take it out of the IP strategy structure.
From a contractor point of view, I haven't heard that we would be adapting to any IoT standards as a construction company or as a overall industry. That is coming from the end user's point of view. But for us to be interoperable with the design and engineering team, we are adapting to the BIM standards and maybe IFC standards if we would be operating on a global level. So there are standards that are tapping into the topic in construction industry, but I'd say that we are probably a laggard in that as an industry overall. So we are adapting to what our customers and the developers are asking for us. So there is the LEED standard and WELL standard and all that, but that is rippling to our share from the design and engineering side, and depending on the owners of the buildings, that's what they require.
Personally, I have a like-hate relationship with standards, and not a love-hate, but a like-hate. The like part is, I think standards are needed as an admonishment for an industry that hasn't been able to deliver. So I think of LEED. So LEED came out of, back in the 70s and 80s during the energy crisis, we made some really bad buildings as an industry. Dark tinted windows, didn't let light in, artificial lighting, artificial ventilation, all these things that were awful. And so LEED came around and said, whoa, wait a second, these things are energy hogs. The built environment takes up an incredible amount of energy and then spits out an enormous amount of pollution as well, an enormous amount of carbon. So the admonishment part is important because it's saying, wait, this is the standard. You have to meet this. And the well standard, I think, is important as well in that regards to make sure we're building places that people want to be in. The challenge I have with it is that we should have just been designing smart all along. We should have understood. I have a Bachelor of Environmental Design, and so it's back in like this, it comes from the 60s and 70s where people know where to put shading, how to position a building, the right materials to use to make sure that you have the right condition and environment on the inside. So the hate side for me, as you can get, is that I think standards are around consensus building. So back to this idea of how you democratize things. I'm a rebel. I feel like when you have a standard, you should go well beyond that standard. You should create a new standard, whatever the right language is. I think it's people who they are reactive and they're setting a standard based on what's happened in the past versus what should be set for what's coming in the future. If you're not familiar, the 2030 Building Challenge was actually something that came out in the early 2000s. I thought that was one of the better standards, and what it said was that the built environment would be essentially carbon neutral by 2030. That's a great standard. That's something where people say, yeah, it's going to be a challenge to get there, so let's take the steps to get there. Everything else, though, for me, in what we do seems to be more incremental and tied to the past.
Great. I'm not going to ask you about your wildest projects that you're most excited about that may not be standard, but I want to make sure you can share that in the Q&A section if you'd like. But I want to make sure that we have a couple minutes left for questions. So any questions from the audience for our panelists today?
I've got a question if nobody else does.
Oh.
Wait, I saw a hand starting there.
Starting to rise, but I wouldn't want to cut off your brilliant question.
Well, how about I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
I have a relatively simple one. I want to know who owns the data. Is it, yeah, right, relatively simple. Is it the device manufacturer who, owns all the systems that's got the data? Is it the building owner, which is not always the same as the tenant, which is not always the same as the individual moving through? Do you have an answer? I was.
Yeah.
You sort of did this, so you're on the
That was
hook.
to ask a question, but to answer, sure. I think there has to be co-ownership of data. And some people get the original data, some people get aggregated and anonymized versions of the data, and there has to be rights over who can use the data for what purposes. So we avoid the creepy scenario, but we also get as much utility out of it as possible.
Yeah, so there's almost like a passport for data.
Should be negotiable. Yeah, and it is. I'd argue it is negotiable.
Well, I think you've earned the right to ask a question. I'm
good
glad
answer.
you didn't say that. I'm glad you didn't say that it's all going to be on a blockchain. That's another plausible answer. Go ahead. Do you want a microphone?
No, my question was more about, we've heard a lot about sort of the sensor standards in building, et cetera. Heard a little bit about personalization, but not as much about how do factories and offices give people feedback about the work they're doing or the environment they're doing. So, in a factory with the right systems, we can actually help encourage workers to do better work based on feedback from the environment that they're getting. And that seems to be starting to happen in some areas, but I'd be interested to see whether or not you've seen that broadly and is that a trend that's growing, and if so, how quickly?
In the factory environment, I've seen it in kind of two different ways. One we've talked a little bit about, which is kind of in the training environment. There's a company that manufactures paper mills. Paper mills are 2 kilometers long, so think mini city blocks. That's a very complicated piece of equipment. If you are the new technician on the block, or I don't care if you've been there for 10 years, finding those components, understanding what's going on in the piece of equipment is very complicated. And so we're seeing such companies develop essentially AR applications where you can sort of tap the glasses and get somebody to drop in and work with you. And also they can kind of look at, if you're solving a particular problem, there are patterns about how that problem gets solved, even the questions and the data that you get from that piece of equipment. And so you can get feedback on, hey, if you had, gotten some additional data data from the paper strength monitor. That would have gotten you to the point that the roll is sticking faster. So there's the attempt to kind of provide guidance on how to do a job better. Which is always tricky. We don't like being told that we're not doing terribly well. There's also companies like one called Medjool, which makes a connected belt system that has a bunch of sensors on it. That's not so much about doing a job better. It's about ergonomics and are you taking care of yourself in your role? And I don't know if Medjool has it, but I've seen other systems that have some haptic feedback to be able to, sort of give you, again, my little Apple Watch here, give you the kind of tap that says, hey, stand up a little straighter, or pause what you're doing, check the app because you're doing something which could potentially harm, your work. And it turns out, I guess there are 1,000 deaths a year from forklift accidents. I learned this in their stats, but so even just collision avoidance is important.
Great. We have time for one more question.
There was one.
Yeah, please go ahead. And please speak up.
I don't think actually we are driving towards the right goal when we're asking what's the future of office. I think the future of office should be no office. Like, I really hate my commute, and I don't think anybody loves commuting. And you are bringing 60,000 people to Seattle. You are building the rabbit warrens, for those people. And I'm sorry, I have no field to place on you, but so,
They're building our buildings.
how do we enable everybody to be productive from the town in Montana, from Ohio, from the Porterville town in Texas? How do we enable people to communicate and be productive and engage with each other without cramming them into the same building that was essentially designed in the 50s when the automobile was available to everybody? So we said, let's move them to the suburbs.
Yeah.
Let's bring them in the city every morning and then pull them out in the evening.
Great question. We have time for one quick answer.
So, amen. There's a lot there. I was going to say, I love the notion of being able to work virtually, but you all know the challenges that come along with that. I'm going to answer this with a non-technology answer. We are social beings at our core. And
No, sorry. And actually, I want to blame Joseph on this, as the representative of friends of the government, because our cities are not designed correctly. I mean, we know from a psychology perspective that we are designed to work for 52 minutes and then break for 17 minutes when we are supposed to walk around in the nature and interact with other humans about non-work issues. So basically the answer is a new type of village where it's like work and life. You work, in a home, you step outside.
so that's exactly why we enlisted a neuroscientist 4 years ago. It's why we are pushing to have neuroscience and design as a co-partnership at the academic world, because there's so much we can learn even from the psychological side relative to who we are versus just bricks and mortar.
Well, we're out of time. Please give a round of applause to this amazing panel.